You were told the Vikings were mindless butchers, that they lived for blood and chaos. That story was written by people who were terrified of them. The truth is colder and far more disturbing. They didn't survive because they were violent. They survived because they understood fear and how to use it. Not every raid was madness. Not every killing was random. Much of what you think you know was never meant to be accurate. They came from the sea without warning. Longships cutting through cold water, shields lined along the sides, and behind them, a reputation that still terrifies the modern mind. For centuries, Vikings have been remembered as savage raiders, bloodthirsty, lawless, brutal beyond reason. Men who burned villages, butchered monks, and vanished back into the mist. But here's the uncomfortable truth. That image was carefully built, and much of it was written by their enemies. Because when you strip away the fear, the myths, and the propaganda, the Vikings become something far more complex and far more unsettling. The first time Europe truly noticed them was in the year 793, the raid on the monastery of Lindisfarne. Monks described it as the end of the world. Holy ground desecrated, relics stolen, brothers killed or dragged away in chains. To Christian Europe, this wasn't just violence. It was sacrilege. To them, this wasn't just a raid. It was proof that the world no longer made sense. And that matters, because almost everything we know about early Viking raids comes from Christian writers. Men who saw the Norse not just as enemies, but as agents of chaos sent by God to punish sin. So the story was framed carefully. The Vikings weren't human adversaries. They were monsters. But even in Lindisfarne, the full story is murkier than legend suggests. The monastery wasn't a peaceful backwater. It was rich, overflowing with gold, silver, and food. And it was completely undefended. From a Viking perspective, it wasn't madness. It was opportunity. And that pattern repeats again and again. Viking raids targeted wealth, not slaughter. Monasteries, market towns, coastal centers of trade, places where portable riches could be taken quickly. Violence happened. There's no denying that. But indiscriminate killing was bad business. Dead men can't pay ransom. Dead villages don't trade. In fact, one of the most profitable Viking practices wasn't murder. It was kidnapping. High-status captives were worth fortunes, ransomed back to their families, or sold into slavery across Europe and the Middle East. Savage. Yes, by modern standards. But uniquely savage? Not even close. At the same time, Vikings were raiding England and Francia. European armies were doing far worse. Charlemagne, the great Christian emperor, slaughtered thousands of Saxons in forced conversions. He executed entire villages for refusing baptism. Yet history remembers him as a civilizer. The difference wasn't behavior. It was who held the pen, and the Vikings never did. Here's something rarely mentioned. Viking society was ruled by law. Not kings at first, not emperors. Law. The Norse held assemblies called things, public gatherings where disputes were settled, laws were spoken aloud, and leaders were challenged. Justice wasn't gentle, but it was structured. Murder required compensation. Outlawry was a punishment worse than death. Feuds were regulated, not endless. This wasn't chaos. It was a functioning legal culture. Even women, by medieval standards, held unusual power. They could own property, divorce husbands, control farms and businesses. When men left on raids or trade voyages, women ran the household economy. That alone shatters the image of a purely brutal, male-dominated war culture. And trade. Trade was everything. The same ships that carried warriors also carried furs, amber, walrus ivory, and slaves. Viking traders reached Baghdad, Constantinople, the rivers of Russia. They didn't just steal wealth, they moved it. In many places, Vikings didn't conquer by fire. They settled. In Ireland, they founded cities like Dublin. In Normandy, they became nobles. In England, they farmed, married, and blended into local society. A Viking who stopped raiding didn't become peaceful. He became permanent. Over time, the raiders became neighbors. So why does the savage image endure? Because fear travels faster than truth. A Viking raid was sudden, terrifying, and unpredictable. Villages had no warning systems, no standing armies nearby, and the psychological impact was enormous. Imagine living on the coast, watching dark shapes on the horizon, knowing help would never arrive in time. That terror burned itself into memory, and memory became legend. But here's where the story turns darker. Viking brutality wasn't random. It was selective. They used fear as a weapon. Reputation mattered. If people believed Vikings were unstoppable monsters, towns surrendered faster. Ransoms were paid quicker. Resistance collapsed. The myth of savagery was useful, and the Vikings leaned into it. Carved dragon heads, battle cries, ruthless retaliation against resistance. They understood something deeply human. Fear is cheaper than war. But even so, they followed rules of honor that outsiders rarely understood. Oaths were sacred. Hospitality mattered. Revenge had limits. Breaking these codes wasn't bravery. It was shame. And that's the paradox. The same men who could butcher enemies in battle would risk their lives to keep a promise. The same culture that glorified combat also feared dying without honor more than death itself. Which brings us to the most misunderstood part of all. Viking violence wasn't about cruelty. It was about survival, status, and reputation in a harsh world. Scandinavia was poor. Land was limited. Winters were brutal. Young men without inheritance had few options: raid, trade, or starve. Raiding wasn't madness. It was economics. And when Christianity finally spread north, something interesting happened. The raids slowed. Not because Vikings suddenly became peaceful, but because their world changed. Kings centralized power. Trade routes stabilized. Land ownership became clearer. The age of raiding faded, but the people didn't disappear. They became farmers, merchants, nobles. The so-called savages built medieval Europe alongside everyone else. So were Vikings really savage raiders? Yes, they raided, they killed. They terrified entire regions. But they were also lawmakers, traders, explorers, and settlers. No more brutal than their contemporaries, just more honest about it. Violence didn't shock the medieval world. Hypocrisy did. The real myth isn't that Vikings were monsters. The myth is that everyone else wasn't.